The stream behind Frank Jackson's modest ranch home had been there long before the neighborhood existed, long before the town itself. It meandered gently through his half-acre lot, no more than 3 feet wide and a foot deep at its center, creating a natural boundary between his property and the Thompsons next door. Frank, a plumber by trade for nearly 4 decades, had always appreciated the irony of spending his days fixing water problems while finding his peace beside the free-flowing water in his own backyard. "Mr. Jackson. Look what I caught." 10-year-old Aiden Thompson splashed through the shallow crossing, his cupped hands cradling a tiny bronze-backed crayfish. His sister Emma, 8, peered over his shoulder, her honey-blonde braids dangling dangerously close to the creature's pincers. "Careful there," Frank smiled, setting down his coffee mug on the weathered cedar bench he'd built facing the water. "Those little fellows can give you quite a pinch." Morning sunlight filtered through the maple canopy, casting dappled shadows that danced across the water's surface. Downstream, near the Thompson property, a great blue heron stood motionless, its reflection perfectly mirrored in a still pool. "My grandfather used to tell me the stream has been flowing since before the Revolutionary War," Frank told the children. "Said the water comes from a spring up in the hills that never runs dry, even in the worst droughts." Emma's eyes widened. "That's older than America." Frank chuckled, feeling the familiar peace that had sustained him through divorce, an empty nest, and retirement. The stream was his constant companion, its gentle babbling a reminder that some things endure despite the world's chaos. Until the certified letter arrived that Tuesday morning, changing everything. #the unwelcome notice. Frank's hands, calloused from decades of wrenching pipes, trembled slightly as he tore open the certified envelope. The return address bore the unfamiliar logo of Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, an organization he'd never agreed to join. "Notice of violation," read the bold, red letters across the top of the letter. "Unauthorized waterway and associated hazards." He lowered himself into his kitchen chair, the vinyl squeaking beneath his weight. Morning sunlight streamed through the gingham curtains his late wife had sewn 20 years earlier, casting a checkered pattern across the formal document. Pursuant to Bylaw 17.3 of the Meadowbrook Estates Covenant, all water features must be approved, properly contained, and maintained according to association standards. The natural stream traversing your property presents significant liability concerns including but not limited to drowning hazard, mosquito breeding, potential flooding, and degradation of adjacent property values. Frank's jaw tightened. Liability concerns? The stream was barely knee-deep at its deepest point. "You are hereby ordered to eliminate this hazard within 30 days by properly filling and grading the watercourse. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $150 and potential lien proceedings against your property." The signature at the bottom belonged to Karen Westfield, HOA president, whose sprawling 6,000-square-foot, craftsman-inspired mansion had replaced the charming Miller farmhouse on the hill last spring. Frank had never spoken more than 10 words to the woman or her husband Richard, an investment banker who commuted to the city in a gleaming black Tesla. "This is ridiculous," Frank muttered, reaching for the phone. He dialed the number on the letterhead, drumming his fingers against the worn Formica countertop as it rang. "Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is Karen," came the crisp, professional voice. "Mrs. Westfield, this is Frank Jackson from Oak Lane. I've just received some kind of violation notice about my stream, and there must be a mistake. I've never joined any homeowners association." There was a pause, then a soft, practiced chuckle. "Mr. Jackson, your property was automatically incorporated into the association when we registered with the county last month. Didn't you receive the welcome packet?" Frank recalled tossing away a glossy folder filled with what he'd assumed was junk mail. "That doesn't mean you can tell me what to do with a natural waterway that's been here for centuries." "I understand your attachment to your rustic water feature," Karen replied, her voice cooling several degrees. "But the board has determined it poses significant risks. Several homeowners have expressed concerns about their children's safety and potential property damage." "Which homeowners?" Frank challenged. "The Thompsons' kids play in that stream every day with my permission." "Who exactly is complaining?" Another pause. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." The decision stands, Mr. Jackson. 30 days. Through his kitchen window, Frank could see the Thompsons' backyard, where Beth Thompson was hanging laundry on a clothesline, occasionally glancing toward the stream with a smile as her children waded in the shallows, net in hand, hunting for minnows. "This isn't right," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "That stream was here before any of our houses, before the roads, before this town even existed." "Progress requires change, Mr. Jackson," Karen replied smoothly. "I suggest you consult the covenant guidelines and begin making arrangements for compliance." "Good day." The line went dead, leaving Frank staring at the notice, a knot forming in his stomach. Beyond his window, sunlight danced on the water's surface, creating ripples of gold that had comforted him through the loneliest days after Margaret's passing. The thought of destroying it felt like a betrayal, not just of nature, but of his own history. What he didn't know then was that Karen Westfield's insistence had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with a secret buried beneath her pristine property, a secret that would soon come bubbling to the surface, quite literally. #uncovering the truth. Frank couldn't sleep. At 2:17 a.m., he sat at his kitchen table nursing a mug of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. Rain pattered against the roof, and through the window, he could hear the stream's flow strengthening with the downpour. 28 days remained until the HOA deadline, and he'd spent the past 48 hours researching everything from riparian rights to environmental protection statutes. His kitchen table had disappeared beneath printouts, county records, and legal pads filled with his careful handwriting. None of it made sense. How could a newly formed HOA force him to destroy a natural waterway that predated the neighborhood by centuries? The phone rang, startling him. Who would call at this hour? "Frank? It's Elaine Moretti from down the street. I'm sorry to call so late, but I saw your lights on." Elaine, a retired environmental science teacher, lived 3 houses down in a tidy Cape Cod with gardens that had won the county fair's blue ribbon 5 years running. "Is everything all right, Elaine?" "No, it's not." Her voice was tight with anger. "I just got home from visiting my daughter in Tucson. Found an HOA violation notice about my rain barrels and native plant garden. They're claiming it's unsightly and harbors pests." "Frank, I've had those rain barrels for 15 years." Frank's jaw clenched. "They sent me one about the stream. Want me to fill it in completely." "The stream? That's absurd." Elaine paused. "Frank, something doesn't add up. I drove past the Westfields' place tonight and noticed something odd. There's a new drainage pipe running down from their property toward the woods behind your place." Frank straightened in his chair. "What kind of pipe?" "PVC, about 8 inches in diameter." "And Frank," her voice dropped to a whisper, "it wasn't there 2 weeks ago when I left town." A plumber for 38 years, Frank knew exactly what an 8-inch drainage pipe typically meant. "I'm going to check something out. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Say, 7 o'clock at my place? I'll bring coffee." The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time Frank pulled on his rubber boots and grabbed a flashlight. The night air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and spring growth as he followed the stream upward, beyond his property line and into the wooded area that separated his lot from the Westfields' 5-acre estate. His flashlight beam caught something white against the dark foliage, PVC piping, just as Elaine had described. It emerged from the hillside and emptied directly into the stream, 100 yards upstream from his property. Frank knelt, examining the installation. It was new, hastily done, with disturbed soil still evident around the pipe's emergence point. He waited, watching. After a few minutes, a surge of cloudy water gushed from the pipe, carrying a distinctive odor that every plumber recognized instantly. "Son of a bitch," Frank muttered, stepping back. "They're dumping their sewage into my stream." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Westfields' mansion sat on what had once been wetlands, land that percolated poorly and made traditional septic systems challenging. Rather than install an expensive alternative system, they'd simply diverted their waste downstream, directly into the natural waterway they now claimed was a hazard. Frank's hands curled into fists, his breath coming in short, angry bursts that fogged in the cool night air. This wasn't about safety or property values. This was about covering up their illegal dumping by eliminating the evidence, the stream itself. As he trudged back home through the drizzle, boots squelching in the mud, Frank's initial despair hardened into resolve. He'd spent his life fixing other people's plumbing problems. Now, he'd fix this one, not with wrenches and pipe cutters, but with truth and justice. The Westfields had no idea what forces they'd just set in motion. #gathering the evidence. The morning arrived with the soft golden light of early spring, dew glistening on grass still bent from the night's rain. Frank sat on his back porch with Elaine Moretti and Jim Thompson, the three of them hunched over steaming mugs of coffee as chickadees darted between the bird feeders hanging from the maple branches. "I still can't believe it," Jim said, shaking his head. A construction foreman with salt and pepper hair and hands as calloused as Frank's, he'd been horrified to learn his children had been playing in water potentially contaminated with the Westfield sewage. "How do we prove it, though?" Frank spread out the county plat map on the patio table, its edges curling slightly in the morning humidity. "See this? The Westfield's property sits on what used to be called Miller's Marsh. Old Man Miller drained most of it to build the original farmhouse, but the soil there never percolated well." Elaine nodded, tapping the map with her finger. "I taught environmental science for 30 years. That whole hillside is clay soil with a high water table. Any septic system there would need specialized engineering, expensive engineering. And our new neighbors don't strike me as people who like spending money they don't have to," Frank added, the bitterness evident in his voice. Jim leaned forward. "So what's our next step?" "The HOA deadline is, 27 days from now?" 26, Frank corrected grimly. "First, we document everything. I've got a friend at the county health department who can test the water quality. Then we need to understand exactly what permits the Westfields pulled for their septic system." Elaine was already making notes on a small pad, her handwriting neat and precise. "I'll handle the research on environmental regulations. If they're discharging sewage into a natural waterway, that violates at least 3 federal statutes I can think of off the top of my head. And I'll talk to the other neighbors," Jim offered. "Beth and I hosted a block party last summer, everyone came except the Westfields. People around here care about this neighborhood. They won't stand for this kind of thing." The stream gurgled peacefully behind them, sunlight dancing on its surface as if nothing were amiss. A pair of cardinals flitted to the bird bath at the water's edge, their bright red plumage a stark contrast against the green foliage. "You know what really gets me?" Frank said quietly, his eyes fixed on the water. "Margaret and I bought this place 42 years ago because of that stream. She used to sit out here for hours, just watching the water flow. Said it reminded her that no matter how stuck we might feel, life always keeps moving forward." His voice caught slightly. Jim placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of wordless understanding between men who communicated more through actions than emotions. "We won't let them take this from you, Frank," Elaine said, her voice steely with determination. "Or from any of us." The vibration of a phone interrupted the moment. Frank pulled his cell from his pocket, frowning at the unfamiliar number. "Hello? Mr. Jackson? This is Richard Westfield." The voice was smooth, cultured, with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I understand you've had some concerns about the HOA notice. Perhaps we could discuss this like reasonable neighbors. Say, over dinner at our place this evening? Karen makes an excellent cocoa vin." Frank's eyes met Elaine's, then Jim's. Both nodded slightly. "That sounds fine, Mr. Westfield," Frank replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger simmering beneath. "What time would be convenient?" 7 o'clock. "And please, call me Richard. After all, we're neighbors." As Frank ended the call, a grim smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, looks like I'm having dinner with the enemy tonight." Jim leaned forward. "Be careful, Frank. These people didn't get rich by playing fair." "Oh, I know," Frank replied, watching a blue heron land gracefully at the stream's edge. "But neither did they count on taking on a plumber who knows his shit." For the first time in days, the three friends laughed, the sound mingling with the stream's gentle burbling, a reminder that some forces of nature couldn't be easily silenced. #dinner with the enemy. The Westfield's mansion loomed against the twilight sky, its stone facade and soaring gables illuminated by carefully positioned landscape lighting. Frank parked his 15-year-old Ford F-150 between a Mercedes SUV and a sleek Audi convertible, feeling distinctly out of place. He'd changed into his good clothes, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt Margaret had given him 3 Christmases before her passing, but he knew no amount of dressing up could disguise what he was, a working man about to enter a world built on appearances. The massive front door swung open before he could ring the bell, revealing Richard Westfield in perfectly pressed chinos and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Frank's monthly pension. "Frank. Welcome to our humble abode." Richard's handshake was firm, practiced, the grip of a man who'd sealed million-dollar deals with the same gesture. Come in, come in. Karen's just finishing up in the kitchen." Humble was hardly the word. The foyer opened to a great room with 20-foot ceilings, a stone fireplace large enough to roast an ox, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley below. Frank could see his own modest ranch home from here, a small rectangle nestled among the trees, the silver ribbon of his stream catching the last light of day. "Beautiful view," Frank commented, his eyes lingering on his property. The stream gurgled peacefully behind them, sunlight dancing on its surface as if nothing were amiss. A pair of cardinals flitted to the bird bath at the water's edge, their bright red plumage a stark contrast against the green foliage. "You know what really gets me?" Frank said quietly, his eyes fixed on the water. "Margaret and I bought this place 42 years ago because of that stream. She used to sit out here for hours, just watching the water flow. Said it reminded her that no matter how stuck we might feel, life always keeps moving forward." His voice caught slightly. Jim placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of wordless understanding between men who communicated more through actions than emotions. "We won't let them take this from you, Frank," Elaine said, her voice steely with determination. "Or from any of us." The vibration of a phone interrupted the moment. Frank pulled his cell from his pocket, frowning at the unfamiliar number. "Hello? Mr. Jackson? This is Richard Westfield." The voice was smooth, cultured, with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I understand you've had some concerns about the HOA notice. Perhaps we could discuss this like reasonable neighbors. Say, over dinner at our place this evening? Karen makes an excellent cocoa vin." Frank's eyes met Elaine's, then Jim's. Both nodded slightly. "That sounds fine, Mr. Westfield," Frank replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger simmering beneath. "What time would be convenient?" 7 o'clock. "And please, call me Richard. After all, we're neighbors." As Frank ended the call, a grim smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, looks like I'm having dinner with the enemy tonight." Jim leaned forward. "Be careful, Frank. These people didn't get rich by playing fair." "Oh, I know," Frank replied, watching a blue heron land gracefully at the stream's edge. "But neither did they count on taking on a plumber who knows his shit." For the first time in days, the three friends laughed, the sound mingling with the stream's gentle burbling, a reminder that some forces of nature couldn't be easily silenced. #dinner with the enemy. The Westfield's mansion loomed against the twilight sky, its stone facade and soaring gables illuminated by carefully positioned landscape lighting. Frank parked his 15-year-old Ford F-150 between a Mercedes SUV and a sleek Audi convertible, feeling distinctly out of place. He'd changed into his good clothes, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt Margaret had given him 3 Christmases before her passing, but he knew no amount of dressing up could disguise what he was, a working man about to enter a world built on appearances. The massive front door swung open before he could ring the bell, revealing Richard Westfield in perfectly pressed chinos and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Frank's monthly pension. "Frank. Welcome to our humble abode." Richard's handshake was firm, practiced, the grip of a man who'd sealed million-dollar deals with the same gesture. Come in, come in. Karen's just finishing up in the kitchen." Humble was hardly the word. The foyer opened to a great room with 20-foot ceilings, a stone fireplace large enough to roast an ox, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley below. Frank could see his own modest ranch home from here, a small rectangle nestled among the trees, the silver ribbon of his stream catching the last light of day. "Beautiful view," Frank commented, his eyes lingering on his property. "Isn't it?" Richard handed him a tumbler of amber liquid. "Single malt, 18 years old. I think you'll appreciate it." Frank accepted the drink but didn't sip. His father, stone sober for the last 40 years of his life, had taught him never to dull his senses around people he didn't trust. Karen Westfield emerged from what must have been the kitchen, though Frank couldn't see any evidence of actual cooking. She wore cream-colored linen pants and a silk blouse, her blonde hair arranged in what Margaret would have called casual perfection. Nothing about Karen Westfield was actually casual. "Mr. Jackson, how lovely you could join us." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Dinner's almost ready. Shall we sit on the terrace? The evening is so pleasant." The terrace, it turned out, was larger than Frank's entire first floor, with an outdoor kitchen, a fire pit, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The valley spread out below them, the neighborhood lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "So, Frank," Richard began once they were seated, "about this stream situation. I understand you're attached to the feature. Sentimental value and all that." "It's not a feature," Frank replied evenly. "It's a natural waterway that's been flowing for centuries." Karen's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. "Well, that's rather the problem, isn't it? Natural means uncontrolled, and uncontrolled water features present liability issues for the entire neighborhood." Frank set down his untouched scotch. "Funny thing about that stream. I noticed it's been carrying more than just rainwater lately." A flicker passed between the Westfields, so brief Frank might have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. "I'm not sure what you mean," Richard said, his voice still smooth but with a new edge. "I think you do." Frank leaned forward slightly. "I spent 40 years as a plumber, Mr. Westfield. I know sewage when I see it, and when I smell it." The practiced smiles vanished. Karen's hand tightened around her wine glass. "That's a serious accusation," Richard said, all pretense of neighborly warmth evaporating. "It is," Frank agreed. "Almost as serious as falsifying septic permits or violating the Clean Water Act. Federal offenses, both of them." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a whippoorwill calling from the woods. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Jackson?" Karen finally asked, her voice cold. Frank looked out over the valley, to where his stream had flowed faithfully for generations before the Westfields had ever set foot in Meadowbrook. "I want you to fix your septic system properly. I want you to dissolve this sham HOA. And I want you to leave my stream, and my neighbors, alone." Richard's expression hardened into something ugly. "Or what?" Frank stood, placing his napkin beside his still empty plate. "Or you'll discover that in small towns like ours, old connections run deeper than new money. Thank you for the invitation, but I've suddenly lost my appetite." As he walked back to his truck, Frank could feel their eyes boring into his back. He'd just made powerful enemies, but for the first time since receiving that violation notice, he felt the current shifting in his favor. Frank Jackson's battle against the Westfields reminds us of timeless truths too often forgotten in our modern rush toward progress. When we attempt to bend nature to our will, filling streams, paving wetlands, redirecting what has flowed freely for centuries, we don't conquer nature, we merely postpone its inevitable response. The stream, temporarily buried but never defeated, found its way back to the surface, teaching those who would control it that water, like truth, always finds its own path. Nature operates by laws more enduring than any HOA covenant or human regulation. This story speaks to something deep within us, the understanding that we are stewards, not owners, of the natural world. When communities unite to protect these natural systems, they're preserving not just ecological balance but the very foundation of sustainable human habitation. Frank's stand against corruption reminds us that one person's courage can become a community's salvation. The most profound victories aren't won through wealth or power, but through persistence, truth, and respect for forces greater than ourselves. Has this story of ordinary citizens standing up to protect their natural environment resonated with you? We'd love to hear your experiences with HOAs, environmental preservation, or community activism in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed the power of nature reasserting itself or communities coming together to protect what matters, share your story. Your words might inspire someone else facing similar challenges. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of everyday heroes defending their communities and natural spaces. Each subscription helps us continue sharing these important narratives of resistance and triumph. Visit our website at americanwatershed.org for resources on riparian rights, HOA limitations, and environmental protection statutes that can help you protect the natural features in your own community. Remember, when we protect natural waterways, wetlands, and green spaces, we're not just preserving scenery, we're safeguarding our community's future. Like, share, and join us in celebrating those who stand firm when the currents of greed threaten to erode what matters most.